One seemingly ordinary morning, an 84-year-old black veteran was slapped to the ground by an aggressive biker just for accidentally touching his motorcycle. No one stepped in, no one spoke up, until the sky roared with the sound of helicopter blades. His son and a military convoy arrived, and what happened next shook the entire town. On a small street in the town of Ravenwood, where people had long grown accustomed to the sight of an old man quietly passing by every Thursday morning, that day felt strangely different. Elijah Brooks, a man who once wore the uniform for more than 2 decades and was now 84, only wanted a peaceful morning like any other, to buy a loaf of bread, a few cough drops, and stop by the post office to send a postcard to his grandson at the military academy. In the pocket of his worn coat, he always carried the only keepsake left from a friend who had fallen on the battlefield, a constant reminder that others had sacrificed their lives so he could live to see this day. No one knew that behind his stooped back and slow, measured steps was a story full of pride and wounds that had never truly healed. Elijah had grown used to people passing by without a glance, used to the silence of eyes that no longer remembered the past. But that morning, fate was about to test him once again. As he walked past the entrance of the Iron Horse Bar, where a group of bikers had gathered, the loud laughter and roaring engines did not bother him. He just wanted to go home. Then, as he passed a row of motorcycles lined up along the curb, the worn hem of his old military coat brushed lightly against the handlebars of one. The bike wobbled slightly but didn't fall. Elijah immediately turned back, raised his hand, and offered a gentle smile with his apology. "I'm sorry, son. I guess my coat is heavier than I thought." He didn't realize that his politeness would become the spark. Kyle Renshaw, the largest man in the group, stepped forward, his eyes cold and full of contempt. He didn't bother checking his bike, nor did he acknowledge the apology. Instead, he swung his hand and slapped the old man square across the face. Elijah fell hard onto the concrete, his paper bag tearing open, the loaf of bread rolling into the gutter. No one came to help. No one spoke up. Laughter echoed, mixing with the roar of engines starting up. And amid that cruel scene, Elijah quietly pushed himself up, his eyes showing no anger, no hatred, only a deep, aching pain that came from the humiliation of a lifetime's dignity being trampled so easily. Elijah sat down on the curb, his trembling hands gathering the scattered pieces of bread and stuffing them back into the torn paper bag, as if doing so could somehow salvage the last fragments of his dignity. Across the street, a few people paused to look, then quickly turned away, as if the sight of a humiliated old man might stain their comfortable lives. A woman walking her dog glanced over and changed direction. A couple taking selfies outside a nearby cafe pretended not to notice the scene unfolding right in front of them. No one reached out a hand, no one said a word. In the thick air of indifference, the mocking laughter of the bikers continued to echo, colder than any winter wind blowing through the street. Elijah said nothing. He had been through worse, nights spent in damp trenches, the grim duty of carrying fallen comrades back to base, mornings painted red after artillery fire. But never had he felt as utterly alone as he did now, in his own country, among the very people he had once served and protected. As he tried to stand, a sharp pain shot up his spine, forcing him to collapse again. His cane had rolled out of reach. He looked at it, then at his calloused hands, hands that had once repaired tanks, pulled young soldiers from the rubble. Now, those same hands could do nothing more than pick bread off the ground. Slowly, Elijah reached for the cane, used it to pull himself up, and sat on a nearby bench, breathing heavily. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but he didn't wipe it away. The humiliation hurt more than any wound. Images of his fallen brothers in arms flashed through his mind, men who had died defending an ideal, that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity. Yet here he was, with hair turned white by time, treated as if his life's worth amounted to nothing. A young man walked past with headphones in, his eyes briefly skimming over Elijah before returning to the glow of his phone screen. Elijah raised a hand, maybe to ask for the time, maybe just to be seen. But the young man was gone before he could say a word. He didn't need pity. All he wanted was a sign that he still existed. Inside the bar, Kyle was boasting to his friends about his achievement, his laughter cutting through the air along with crude jokes. "That old man should learn how to watch where he's going," he sneered. Elijah heard every word, but remained silent, not because he was weak, but because he knew some battles cannot be won with fists or bullets. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out an old phone. The screen cracked, the buttons loose. In his contacts, there was only one number marked Falcon, Emergency. Elijah stared at it for a long moment. He had promised himself he would never use that number unless it was absolutely necessary. But today, this wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. About the honor of those who had shed blood so he could sit here today. About the truth that no veteran should ever endure such humiliation. He pressed the call button and set the phone down on the bench, his gaze drifting toward the end of the street. Inside, there was no hatred, only a deep sorrow and a quiet resolve. The silence would not last forever. About 15 minutes passed in stillness, broken only by the hum of passing cars and the wind through the trees. Elijah didn't move. He didn't leave. He sat there as if waiting for a ride only he knew was coming. Deep down, he felt something was about to happen, something that would forever change this moment of humiliation. And indeed, just minutes later, the ground beneath him began to tremble ever so slightly, as if something powerful was drawing near. At first, the rumble felt like nothing more than a passing truck. But then, the ground began to shake harder, windows rattled, coffee cups on cafe tables trembled. People looked around confused. A man dropped his newspaper. A waitress stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the bright sun to peer into the distance. The sound wasn't like a regular engine. It was rhythmic, deep, and powerful, like the heartbeat of some giant beast drawing near. Then someone shouted, "Helicopter! Something's happening!" And seconds later, from beyond the horizon, a black-painted Black Hawk helicopter roared into view, its blades slicing through the air and whipping up a storm of dust over Ravenwood's sky. No one could believe their eyes. A quiet little town had suddenly become the backdrop of a scene straight out of a movie. The helicopter swooped low, circled once, then landed in an empty lot behind the row of shops, shaking the entire street. Back inside, there was no hatred, only a deep sorrow and a quiet resolve. The silence would not last forever. At the same time, from opposite directions, two armored SUVs sped in and screeched to a halt right in front of the Iron Horse Bar. The doors flew open simultaneously. A team of more than a dozen men in black tactical gear stepped out, moving in perfect, disciplined formation. No one shouted, no one drew a weapon. But from the way they moved, quick, precise, and ice-cold, it was obvious they weren't ordinary law enforcement. The atmosphere changed instantly. The bikers' laughter died mid-sentence. A few tried to step back but froze under the razor-sharp stares of the newcomers. People on the street pulled out their phones to film, whispering among themselves. A tense silence, tight as a drawn bowstring, fell over everything. From the lead SUV, a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his stance steady and commanding, streaks of gray in his hair, but a steely fire in his eyes. Every step radiated the authority of someone used to giving orders and being obeyed. He didn't need an introduction. Everyone knew he was the one in charge. He walked straight toward the bench where Elijah still sat, motionless like a statue. As he approached, he knelt down, and in his eyes was a rare mixture of pain and reverence. "Dad," he said softly, his hand gently brushing the dried blood at the corner of Elijah's mouth. "I'm here." Elijah looked up, his gaze calm, as if everything unfolding had been part of a truth he'd known all along. "My son," he murmured. No more words were needed. Both men understood this wasn't a battle either of them fought alone. The arrival of Malcolm Brooks, commander of the elite Falcon Strike Unit and Elijah's only son, was like a lightning bolt that shattered the town's indifference. The biters weren't laughing anymore. Kyle, the one who had slapped Elijah, felt a chill run down his spine as Malcolm's gaze fixed on him. It wasn't angry or threatening. It was the gaze of someone who knew his power was too great to ever need proving. Malcolm straightened, his voice deep and deliberate with every word. Who here thought it was acceptable to strike a veteran who served this nation before you could even spell your own names? No one answered. No one dared. The air grew heavier. Kyle swallowed hard, took half a step forward, raising his hands as if to explain. "It was just an accident. He touched my bike." Malcolm stepped closer, the distance between them now only a few feet. There is no such thing as an accident when it comes with humiliation. He paused for a beat, then continued, his voice cold as steel. "And there is no silence acceptable when honor is trampled." A radio crackled on one of the operatives' shoulders, and minutes later, police cars arrived. No sirens, no flashing lights. They didn't ask questions. When Malcolm pointed at Kyle, 2 officers stepped forward and handcuffed him in utter silence. There was no more laughter, no more contemptuous stares. The entire street stood still, witnessing a moment no one would ever forget. The old man who had been knocked to the ground was no longer alone. An elite unit and justice itself now stood beside him. The air in Ravenwood after the arrest felt compressed, silent, yet so heavy with tension that everyone could sense something far greater was unfolding. As Kyle was handcuffed and escorted into the back of a police car, the crowd lining the sidewalks simply watched in silence. No one jeered, and no one applauded. The silence now was no longer the same indifference as before. It was the weighty silence of regret, shame, and reflection. People were beginning to realize that what had happened that day was not just an assault on an old man. It was an insult to an entire generation that had sacrificed everything so this country could exist. At the same time, a bystander's secretly recorded video of the entire incident hit social media. Within hours, it spread like wildfire, accompanied by furious captions. "A veteran assaulted in broad daylight. Is this how we treat those who once defended our freedom? Unbelievable how the crowd did nothing." Under mounting public pressure, Police Chief Ramon Diaz called an emergency press conference. He announced that Kyle Renshaw would face multiple charges, including assaulting an elderly person, insulting a veteran, and disrupting public order. The investigation also revealed Kyle's past. He had once been arrested for vandalizing a war memorial and disrupting a memorial event. That revelation only fueled the outrage further. From across the nation, veterans associations, social organizations, and even schools sent letters demanding that the government uphold the honor of those who served. Malcolm stood before the media, not as a special forces commander, but as a son. He spoke briefly, yet his words left the nation speechless. When a man who once wore this country's uniform is beaten in the street and no one stands up, we have let the dignity of an entire nation fall to the ground. Those words were shared millions of times and quickly became a rallying cry across the country. On Liberty Street, the site of the incident, people began to gather. They brought flags, flowers, and signs of gratitude. There were no angry slogans, no shouted chants. People simply stood in silence, as if to offer an unspoken apology for their earlier silence. A group of veterans in faded uniforms, medals pinned to their chests, approached Elijah. They formed a line in front of him and raised their hands in a crisp military salute. No words were spoken, but their eyes said it all: respect, gratitude, and pride. Elijah sat there, his eyes glistening. He didn't need this crowd to validate his worth, but in that moment, all the humiliation of that morning was washed away. A boy, no more than 10 years old, stepped out of the crowd holding a small flag. He stood at attention and gave a clumsy salute, the way he'd learned from his history book. Elijah gently bowed his head in return. In that instant, the distance between past and present seemed to vanish. Elijah was no longer the old man who got slapped. He was a symbol of millions who had once placed their lives on the line because they believed in what was right. By nightfall, the national news networks were broadcasting live from Ravenwood. They didn't just report on an assault, they told Elijah's life story. From a mechanic during the Gulf War, to a soldier who pulled his comrades from a burning vehicle, to a man who had lived quietly for decades after his service. The medals, the sacrifices, all were retold as proof that he and those like him were never invisible. When a reporter asked Elijah if he had any words for Kyle, he replied with a single sentence that brought the studio to a standstill. "I don't want anyone to be hated. I just don't want anyone to be forgotten." Those words spread far beyond the case itself. They became a message to society, a reminder of respect, of responsibility, and of the duty to stand up when justice calls. In the weeks following the incident, Kyle Renshaw remained behind bars awaiting trial. His name flooded the headlines, branded with harsh labels like the betrayer of gratitude and the face of indifference. Former friends abandoned him. His biker gang expelled him out of fear of being associated, and he lost his job, his reputation, and faced years in prison. Yet the harshest punishment wasn't the sentence that awaited him. It was the moment he saw that image of Elijah sitting on the bench, eyes deep and free of hatred. That gaze neither condemned nor cursed him. It was simply a mirror, reflecting the emptiness and smallness he had long tried to hide beneath his swagger and arrogance. One night in his cell, Kyle wrote a short letter to Elijah. The handwriting was messy, the sentences clumsy. "If you're willing to meet me, I'd like to apologize. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need to say it." The letter reached Elijah a few days later. He could have thrown it away. He could have chosen to forget. But the heart of a man who had watched his brothers fall on the battlefield wouldn't allow that. He knew that some people weren't born cruel. They were simply guided by wounds that had never healed. He asked Malcolm to arrange a private meeting before the trial. The room in the courthouse was silent. Kyle sat hunched over, hands clasped and trembling. When Elijah entered, he couldn't bring himself to look up. "I didn't know who you were," Kyle began, his voice hoarse. Elijah interrupted gently. "The problem isn't that you didn't know. The problem is that you didn't care." Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes red. "My father was a soldier too. He came back from Vietnam, but he was never the same man again. I grew up angry at the military for taking him from me, and I thought everyone who wore a uniform deserved to be hated." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've met many men like your father. They carry memories no one else can truly understand. But anger doesn't heal pain, son. It only passes it on." Kyle broke down in tears. Real tears, the kind he hadn't shed since childhood. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and slid it across the table. "The court might order me to go to therapy, but I've already signed up voluntarily. And I want to volunteer at the Veterans Center. I don't know what I can do, but I want to try." Elijah looked at the paper, then at Kyle. He placed his calloused hand gently over the younger man's trembling one. "You won't make amends in a day or a month. But every time you show up, every time you help someone, you'll be one step closer to the man you want to become." The meeting ended in silence. There were no handshakes, no empty promises, just raw truth and a fragile spark of hope. In the months that followed, Kyle began working at the Veterans Center. At first, he did simple tasks, cleaning storage rooms, handing out meals. But gradually, he learned to listen to war stories and began to understand the pain he had once mocked. He drove elderly veterans to medical appointments, fixed their cars for free, and spent hours talking with those who were lonely. Each small act was like a brick, slowly rebuilding the man he was from the rubble of who he'd been. Elijah never saw Kyle again after that meeting, but he heard updates from people at the center. Some said Kyle never missed a shift. Others said he'd helped a depressed veteran rediscover his will to live. And every time Elijah heard such stories, he would smile softly. He knew he had done the right thing, not to erase the past, but to give a man a chance to change his future. 6 months after that fateful day, Liberty Street, once the scene of a veteran's humiliation, had transformed into something entirely different. Right where Elijah had sat that morning, a bronze memorial plaque now stood, engraved with a simple inscription: "Elijah Brooks, the man who stood tall when the world turned its back." Beneath it, a single line was etched deeper than all the others. He did not need to be seen. He simply stood. But it wasn't just the plaque. The small park behind the Iron Horse Bar had been renamed Brooks Field. And every year on that day, the people of Ravenwood gathered for a quiet ceremony, not only to honor Elijah, but also to remember those like him, the men and women who had sacrificed their youth to protect freedom and human dignity. Elijah himself continued to live simply, still taking his slow Thursday morning walks in his worn coat and carrying his familiar wooden cane. But one thing had changed. Now, people always greeted him first. A little boy would stand at attention and salute him. A young man would remove his hat and bow his head as Elijah passed. And a young soldier would stop his car just to shake his hand and say thank you. Small gestures, once absent, had become a new habit in the town. Kyle had changed too. He now drove an old van, ferrying veterans to their treatment center twice a week. Sometimes he would stop by their homes to fix electrical issues or help with yard work. Once, Elijah spotted him at a cafe near the square, gently helping an elderly man into his seat. They didn't speak, only exchanged a small nod, like two soldiers on the same journey, even if they had started from opposite sides. One crisp autumn afternoon, Malcolm sat beside his father on the familiar bench. He looked around the square, now proudly bearing the name Brooks Field, where children played beneath a fluttering American flag. "You changed this place, Dad," he said quietly. Elijah smiled, his gaze following the children. "No, son," he replied softly. "They just remembered what truly matters." The evening breeze rustled through the trees, and in the whisper of the leaves, Elijah could still hear the echoes of that day, the distant roar of Blackhawk blades, and the moment a city stopped to learn how to bow its head before courage and dignity. Human dignity doesn't lie in age, status, or the medals we've earned. It lies in how we live, how we treat one another, and how we stand up for what's right. Respect should not come only after someone has been hurt, just as gratitude should not be reserved only for those who have fallen. Every thank you, every act of kindness, every bow to honor a sacrifice is how we keep compassion from being forgotten. Because sometimes a single small gesture is enough to warm a heart that has been deeply wounded. If you believe that kindness and respect can change the world, hit like and share this story to spread the message of love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for your support.